I will talk about one specific thing that often pops up, namely whether a good society requires good people. Okay. So it will be a little bit more, I would say, interactive. So I rely a little bit on your interaction. In the last couple of times, I kept it to a little bit more of the lecture form, but this time I need a little bit of your help. Because we will cover many big topics in political philosophy. We will cover the topic of justice. We will talk a little bit about the role of human nature in political theory. And then we talk a little bit about something that is very niche, but very important at nowadays, I would say, in political philosophy. That's the debate of an ideal versus non-ideal theory. As I said, I do this in English, so therefore, if you have any questions of understanding, just let me know in the chat if I speak too fast or whether you don't understand certain terms. And of course, you will be able to have the slides afterwards. So, I mean, but it's mostly pictures anyways. So this is kind of the flow that I had in mind. So the question about the good society requires that we know what goodness means, right? Like, what is the good society? What is the property of goodness? So if you describe something in philosophy, it's the property that you need to describe, right? Like, what do we mean by goodness? Okay. And that will link immediately to justice and concerns about justice immediately. When we talk about justice, there are various things at work. And I think one of the biggest issues is, well, we might all know what is just, right? Or good. Let's say holding the door open for an old lady, for a babushka, that might be good to do, right? But sometimes we don't do it. Sometimes I'm in a rush myself, right? So there's an issue of what is called compliance. Sometimes we know what would be good to do, but we don't do it. And that's a big problem if you want to build a good society, because for many times we have seen, we know what goodness or just is, but we don't comply with it. So we will talk about the issue of compliance then. Then we talk about human nature, and this is, I think, one of the biggest talking points in political philosophy. And I will give a quick overview of how different thinkers thought about it, and then I will talk about the way liberals thought about this in particular, because I think it's a unique take and quite interesting. And lastly, as I said, we will talk on very contemporary issues. If there's one hot topic nowadays in political theory, it's ideal versus non-ideal theory. And I will talk about that a little bit. And I don't have a conclusion this time. Like, I think this is a super complicated topic. But it gives a lot of floor to work with. So what you get in the next hour roughly is, like, I want to make you think about these fundamental things, okay? Like, political philosophy is abstract. These questions are the highest abstraction you can get in political philosophy, okay? That gets very, as I said, abstract. So let's dive into, because everything about the good society has to start with, what does it mean to be, like, good? Like, when I saw your schedule talking about the good society, or what does it mean good? When would we say we reached a state of goodness, right? And the same requires for people. So we know, and that's Aristotle, we know what a good chair does, right? On a good chair, I can sit. On a good table, I can put things, okay? We know what is good about certain things. But when we talk about complex human things, good society, a good person, what does make them good? Okay. It's complex. Some people have tried to approach it, and as you know, in philosophy, we approach things by thought experiments, because I guess philosophers don't have like money to spend on real experiments, so we do experiments in our minds. But here's one famous thought experiment. It comes from a book called Why Not Socialism by G.A. Cohen. So Jerry Cohen is a very prominent Marxist philosopher. So he says, if we want to envision the good society, we have to envision a camping trip. Okay. I don't know. I'm not a camper, so I don't know why we would envision that. You know, for me, there are too many like animals outside there and it's cold and stuff. But some of you might relate to him. He says, oh, on a camping trip, you don't only have fun by yourself, but on a camping trip, you form a community that helps each other. For example, in a camping trip, you share all the knives and forks and the plates together, and you wash it up together without a division of tasks. You also, if you go fishing on a fishing trip, on a camping trip, you share it with your other fellow campers. If you find an apple or multiple apples, you want to share it with them. So he says a camping trip is fundamentally about living the small good society. You know, everybody likes each other, they do and help out each other, you know, they share things. And he says, if you compare the camping trip and its dynamics to the real world, the camping trip looks like the ideal society. Because what happens in the real capitalistic world is, well, if I fish a fish, I keep the fish. And if you want something, I only sell it to you for money. So you have to give me something, right? Or if I have to do the dishes, well, I expect you to perform something else for me, like kind of reciprocity. But in the ideal case of a camping trip, I don't do that. I do it because we are a camping, I don't know how it's called, a group, you know, a camping group together. Okay, because we are friends and we go on a camping trip. So he says, our modern societies are so complex, they kind of made us detached from what is ideal and what is great. Okay, and the camping trip is certainly something that is great. So this is a first approach of like understanding what a good society means. Okay, however, many people like me have the intuition, well, like if the camping trip is the good society, then I'm not on board with the good society. Maybe a slightly bad society is good for me because I don't like these camping trips. Okay, so maybe I want to hear from you. What do you think is good? What does it mean to be good or just? Okay, so you know from my past experience, at least some of you, you go to a website called menti.com. You don't have to use an app or whatever. You just type it in the browser, and then you need a room code, and the room code is 8606002. I put it in the chat, and then I will share my screen in a second to let you switch over. And it will ask you, let me just switch over. Good. It will ask you, what do you understand as just, or let's make it actually a little bit narrower. What do you understand as good? Okay, so, and you can submit any kind of intuition that you have. And the room code, I put it in the chat, is 8660002. Okay, what do you understand as good or just, whatever it comes, when it comes to society at large? Okay, we're getting already in a good direction. Compassion, not empathy. I mean, the distinction there. Kindness, love, caring, freedom, pleasure, rights, without harming, inclusion, diversity. It fit for its purpose. That's the Aristotelian view, kind of, you know, like it serves the purpose. Like a table is good if you can put something on it, for example. The question, though, however, what is a fit society? You know, what is the purpose of society? Like, if you argue that way, that would be curious to think. That makes, by the way, this whole thing about goodness so interesting from a philosophical perspective, because you don't have a human purpose that is immediately available. Like, people have theorized about it, but it's very difficult to come up with. You know, what makes a human being good? The same way that a chair is good, right? It's very difficult, but more on that later. Okay, responsibility, inclusion, diversity. I mean, it's a very nice group, you know, you see like all the nice words in there, like compassion and inclusion, love, diversity, responsibility. Good. But however, this already reveals that on this very important question of what is good as a society, we don't have a conception. We have some buzzwords that are floating around, but efficiency versus justice versus inclusion, these are very different values. And they are trade-offs, right? Like sometimes if I want to be efficient, I cannot be inclusive or whatever. Actually, that's a real world concern, right? If I want to do efficient, I organize an efficient event, I cannot do maybe the most inclusive event ever, right? So these are very trade-offs, very tangible things that are rival to each other. So, but no, you are not alone. because we have many rival conceptions of justice, and I will come to that, or goodness, in a second. But first, you might wonder, okay, but why do we need to ask this question? This question is maybe only relevant for philosophers. Why should I ask the question, what is justice, right? Because we all know when injustice happens. So you might say, I'm more common sense. If I see, for example, racism, I know it's bad. Why would I need a theory of justice to explain that? Well, here's the thing. What precisely makes racism bad? Okay, we all know it's bad. It's common sense understanding that it's bad, but you need a theory of justice to determine what is precisely bad about it, right? Is it a harm that is done to these individuals? Is it that we violate their dignity? Or is it simply the inequality that it leads to, right? These are different aspects. They are all there, and maybe they are all partially true, right? That all of these features make racism bad. But without a theory of justice, you don't know which policy you want to take to tackle it. For example, let's say only the inequality part is bad about it. You tackle inequality differently than you would tackle the violation of whatever, let's say harm or dignity, okay? So you need to understand injustices, a theory of justice. It would be weird for you to claim something is not good or something is unjust without understanding what good is and what just is, okay? So you need the benchmark. This comes a little bit out of Plato, for those who I guess most of you have read. So Plato has this idea of the forms or the ideas, So he always thinks like every concept has like an ideal form, and we benchmark it against it. Okay. So similarly, you need kind of a benchmark. If you talk about what is good or bad, you need to have an understanding of goodness, I might say. So, are there any good theories of goodness or justice? Well, there are plenty. One might say, we are in a just society once everybody's recognized and everybody has their rights protected. Others say, well, it's much more like everybody gets an equal share out of the resources, Or others say, well, if we reach a certain distribution, for example, those who work hard should be rewarded highly because they put a lot of effort in, and others who don't put so much effort in, they shouldn't be rewarded highly. And they talk always about different things of justice, and they talk about different things of goodness, okay? So it's very confusing what people are actually wanting when we talk about the good society. I think ultimately, when we talk about the good society, we talk about something like the just society, okay? So this is the first move we are making. When we talk about the good society, often we talk about the just society, because there is nothing like the table example for a society, right? A society is good when you can do what with it? Like it would be weird to ask such a question. So for the just society, we have at least a bit more of an indicator. Like maybe the good society is a just society, but then we just outsource the question. If the good society is a just society, then we have to ask, what is justice? And here are like plenty of theories about justice. And I bet you have talked about justice in the formats here too. I will give you one thing about justice that might stimulate your thought a little bit. Namely the theory of John Rawls, because it is so impactful. And like if you ever engage with political theory, you should know a little bit about John Rawls, okay? So if we understand that questions about the good society require to think about the just society or justice, that's maybe the best way to think about it. And there are plenty of things what justice can mean. You just put so many on them on the screen. And I just gave you examples that philosophers have many answers to this. John Rawls took an interesting turn because he himself recognized that the debates about justice were so plentiful and not really fruitful. So he kind of wanted to unite everything and present the ultimate theory of justice. Okay, we are now in the 1970s here, so it's rather contemporary. And John Rawls, an American philosopher at Harvard, he thought, okay, I design a theory of justice, and for that, I let you go through a thought experiment. But let me just quickly, because I don't want to go too much into detail if you all know of this, let me know in the chat, yes or no, if you know about Rawls and his theory of justice. So you can write yes or no in the chat whether you're familiar with Rawls's theory of justice. Okay, wow, you guys are quick. No. Yes. No. Yes. Okay, that's like That's kind of the mixed bag. Okay, for some, I will just give you the upshot, and for the others, since you know it already, you can correct me if I'm wrong. So that's kind of the deal, the social contract that we are making now, since this is very mixed. Okay, so John Rawls was motivated to think about a just society, and he said, let's do a thought experiment. To understand what a just society is, imagine yourself thinking about a just society. And you think about it behind what he calls the veil of ignorance. So you basically imagine yourself having a veil of ignorance in front of your eyes, okay? And you cannot see your position that you would occupy in society. So you detach yourself from your social role. For example, now I know that I benefit to a certain degree from social structures. You know, for example, I'm male, I'm white, I'm heterosexual. You know, like I benefit from certain privileges, but behind a veil of ignorance, I wouldn't know my social position. And Rawls says, if you think about a just society, you have to think behind a veil of ignorance where you don't know your social position, and then imagine what are the best structures, no matter which social position I will occupy, that will serve the interests that we have, or that I have in this case. Okay? So that's what he calls the veil of ignorance and the original position. In the original position, you really think about which society would be desirable, not knowing your own social position. Because if you would know your social position, you would be biased, right? Like if you come from a privileged background, you of course want that this privilege is maintained. If you come from an unprivileged background, you want to have it reversed, right? Like now the unprivileged are the ones that are in charge and get the privileges, you know? So he wants to kind of get you to a state of almost neutrality. However, he says, and this is the interesting move here, he says, for having this thought, you have available all information about human nature and about how human societies work. So this conception about the good society, he kind of implies in a sense of, let's do institutions of a good society where you have all information about how human beings interact in this society available to you. Okay, so he kind of makes claims about human nature innate to this whole thought experiment. What comes out of it, and I don't want to go into detail, are two principles of liberty, two principles of justice. The first principle is the liberty principle. He says liberty is a human value that everybody should have access to. So it's the first principle of Rawls, first principle of justice, called the liberty principle, and he talks about basic liberties accessible to anyone. So check that out. Second principle is twofold, has also two dimensions. One is the inequalities are only permitted if they benefit the least well off. Okay, let that sink in. Inequalities are only okay if they benefit the least well off. So because Rawls wants to recognize in his theory of justice the values of liberty and equality to a certain degree, he says, well, liberty is so important that it gets its own principle, and this principle is always number one. But in the second principle, we talk about inequality, and inequality, well, we have some concerns about it, but we permit it unless or as long as it benefits the least well off. So we allow inequalities as long as it benefits the least well off. So as long as the poorest basically benefit from having some inequalities in the world, that is permitted. And here he recognizes certain features about human nature. I will hold that off for a second, but this is, I think, crucial to understand that Rawls was thinking very hard that his theory of justice is not only for the good people, but it is for human beings in general, not only for ideal human beings, okay? But more on that later on. Just want to raise here awareness for what Rawls is doing, because this gives a lot of traction to the later debate. Okay. And just for completion-wise, the second part of the second principle, so 2b, it's called, there's 2a and 2b, is about opportunities. Like everybody should have access to equal opportunities. Also highly controversial, but I mean, I won't go into detail for this one. These are the two principles of Rawls, Rawls's theory of justice. For you, important to take away, even if you are a little bit confused by what Rawls actually wants, Rawls lets you imagine the ideal society behind the wheel of ignorance. So complete detachment from your personal interest. You should think about justice. That's the best way for him to think about justice. Not like thinking right now in our messy realities, biased by our messy environments in our countries, to think about justice. He says, well, the best way is to detach yourself from that and your own role and think about justice. And the second important part is he doesn't make a claim about human nature. So for him, it is about a just society, not whether good people bring about a good society. Okay, so and that's crucial because now this poses a couple of questions about human nature because he doesn't make one explicitly. I would say he actually says, well, the question of human nature is not something that we debate philosophically. That's kind of his move implicitly. He says, human nature is a debate for the social sciences. And that's why he brings in that behind in this wheel of ignorance position, this original position, you have access to all social science data. Okay, so he leaves this question of human nature unsolved. He wants to not link the just society to just people. And that is curious because historically there has always been some sort of link between the good society and the just society and just people or good people. Just let me just quickly check the chat. Yeah, there is some serious belief in your ability to understand other people's needs without representation. I think that's great, Maria, who wrote that.
Yeah, hi.
Actually, yeah, maybe you jump in and quickly explain what you mean because I think it's a fundamental objection to Rawls.
So we basically assume that just executing this mental exercise, we can understand what is good for all the other people without knowing their situation, without hearing them out. And we assume that if we are privileged, we can always imagine the life for less privileged and somehow include them. But this is, I don't think it's feasible.
Yes, I think that's a common objection to Rawls, to say, well, is it really a mental exercise? Or second, can I just assume? Does it actually make sense to assume and detach myself from these messy realities? Am I able to make such a thought experiment in the first place? It's a common objection that goes along similar lines that liberals often face when it comes to the social contract. Like, for example, state of nature thought experiments assume that you are an individual that makes a contract with society. But I would say especially conservatives have claimed along Aristotelian lines, well, this never happens. We are born as political animals, as social animals. We never are outside of this realm. To think of yourself as an isolated being, not ingrained in society, makes no sense. Like this atomized thinking of the social contract or the state of nature makes no sense. Therefore, they reject this whole thought experiment in Locke, in even Rousseau. So, very good point there, whether it actually makes sense to think about it that way. But again, let's take it for granted that there is something to it. There's also Daniel who commented that Rawls makes some implicit points about human nature. I think he even is at one point explicit. But for now, I hopefully take for granted my line of the argument that Rawls wants to leave human nature to the social sciences to a certain degree. Okay, and that's why he leaves it to the social sciences here. It makes you available in the wheel of ignorance. So let's look closer at human nature. And before I go, so I just want to have an intuition from you, all of you. How do you think about human nature beforehand? So I set up a Menti where you can rate human nature on -5 to +5. So if you think humans are inherently evil, then you rate it -5, and if you think they are pretty good, and give it or super awesome, then +5, and if you think like pretty good, +2 or whatsoever. So the room is the same for the Menti. I just quickly jump around. To the right. Yep. So this should just open the next slide. Okay, so you should see something like that. Is human nature good or evil? You can rate it on -5 to +5. And let me know. Okay, we are in the center now. Let's see how many people submitted. 15, 17. Okay, plus 0.5. Okay, so we have a mixed result. I think, that basically reflects human nature to a certain degree. So a couple of people found human beings pretty good. Like there's, I think, one person, like they maybe had a very bad day, because -5 for overall humanity. My God, what happened to your breakfast? Like there must be something happening today. And then there are a couple of people who rated slightly positive, like a +1 or +2. So, okay. Sounds okay. Let me see in the chat what people are writing. Hobbes happened. Or maybe you had, maybe you were reading Hobbes today. Then I fully understand what's going on. Maybe, then I fully understand what's going on. We talk about the chap Thomas Hobbes in a second, so give me a minute. Okay, this debate about human nature is really not new. There is long-standing debate on human nature itself. Like this example that I gave you about the table, like what is the goodness in the table, or what is the properties of goodness in a table, or the same about a chair or whatsoever. That comes out of Aristotelian thinking, even Socratic thinking to a certain degree. And like people like Aristotle, they were very eager to define a human nature, an objective purpose, for example, to human beings. Okay. However, what I'm here more concerned with is if the moral dimension of humans, like in terms of goodness, like moral properties. Okay. And Aristotle has much to say about it because you, I guess, are familiar with his conception of the virtues. But I want to start with, of course, the most influential conception of human nature and its moral dimension or its goodness to it, which of course is there's a clear religious view, like originating with the original sin. Like human beings, they have been innocent, they have been created as equals to God, and then they sinned by taking the apple in the Garden of Eden, right? The original sin. And that, in St. Augustine, for example, had been very clear that this is the original sin that taints the goodness of human beings. So there is something inherently worrisome about human beings. They are always imperfect, right? They are not perfectly pure or good or whatsoever, right? So there's this dimension to it. And only through divine revelation one can be reinstantiated or like released from these sins that one has, right? So that's a very classic view, and you will see that all over the place, right? Like human beings are imperfect, they are not good, there is like a worry about their moral character. And some even make that claim later on linked. I don't say Richard Dawkins make that claim, but some people say, well, even the way our gene structure is set up makes us inherently selfish and therefore like not linked to what you all linked out as goodness, right? Some of you said caring, empathetic, compassion, altruistic. These are all things that you consider as good, right? Or whatever, just. But it seems that empirically this is even questionable because human beings act selfishly. And that's a question we will touch later upon, whether this is by design, like whether of human beings, or whether it is something that the incentive structure does, like the structures. Because, for example, Marxists claim that the capitalistic structure does something to us. But more on that later. I think these are all debates we are familiar with, but also we don't give so much credit to in philosophy. Yeah. So, is selfishness bad? Daniel asks. We will talk about it in a second. Huh? So, these are the modern debates, I would say. Like the other debate, I mean, if I come you with a religious argument, you might say, okay, that's interesting, the original sin. But I mean, ultimately, come on, we moved on. And indeed, it seems like we have to a certain degree moved on in modern philosophy. And again, I understand modern philosophy as anything that comes after the Enlightenment, okay? So Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Hobbes have two very different visions on human nature. And this is crucial. If there is one distinction in terms of how human nature is seen in political philosophy, I think it can be represented by these two figureheads, Rousseau and Hobbes. I don't say that they're the only ones, but they make the contrast the clearest. Because Jean-Jacques Rousseau has a fundamentally, I would say, romantic view on human nature. I think many of you are familiar with the noble savage, right? So the noble savage idea in Rousseau is that society is what corrupts us. Like if I would just be by myself outside of the forces of society, I would be empathetic, caring, whatsoever. Like I would have the kindest intentions. However, the structures of society and the way we interact with each other corrupts us. And this is just the initial thought by Rousseau. This has later been used by Marx, Hegel, and others to actually claim that certain social structures, in the case of Marx, it's very clear which one is the opposing one, corrupts us, okay? So the capitalistic structures corrupt us to a certain degree. And this line of argument is very dominant until today, right? And it has some plausibility. If you are living in a modern consumer culture, there seems to be some outside forces that determine what are your preferences, what are your values, whatsoever, right? What you perceive as the good life to live, okay? So maybe if we wouldn't be exposed to all these structures in a modern capitalistic system, we would be innocent, good human beings. Then we would do the camping trip, right? Like we would behave like in the camping trip all day long, but now we are reigned by the capitalist overlords with their value system. Therefore, we behave like hedonistic, self-maximizing a-holes, So that might be a line of argumentation, and I think you will find that line of argumentation around. Jerry Cohen, which was the author of this book, Why Not Socialism, is certainly somebody who makes such claims, okay? That the capitalistic structures and the way it is set up corrupts our human nature, okay? And I think there's some plausibility to it. If we think about, also think about the Frankfurt School and cultural dominance, hegemony, like a lot of good, I think interesting stuff. Meanwhile, there's people throwing in the blank slate and I will come also to this. Oh, it's a good group. I see. You guys are throwing stuff at me. I can hardly keep up with your speed, but yeah, keep it coming. So I know what you're interested in. The second option is Thomas Hobbes. So like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, like in the picture is like smiley, optimistic, to a certain degree romantic, right? And then you see Thomas Hobbes, like already in the picture, you see what you can get, like grim guy, British philosopher. So he saw, well, human nature is maybe not like the noble savage. In fact, it seems more like, okay, if we wouldn't have, for example, somebody taking care of human beings, like the Leviathan, then we would have the war of everybody against everybody, the war of all against all, right? Like we would just kill each other. So that's like Thomas Hobbes. So very negative conception of how human nature would work, right? Like inherently uncooperative to a certain degree. We would need some institutions that actually prevent us, that we would kill each other. And I guess to a certain degree that also applies to yeah, regular savage. That applies to some liberals that we have in the field, like John Locke or something. But these are, I think, two fundamentally rival ideas, and you hope you see. These claims are about human nature. They are not necessarily about their politics, right? Because if society corrupts, while the other says, well, the society prevents you from the corrupting feature of human nature, these are two very different claims. One is very optimistic and very pessimistic about human nature, okay? And they have severe implications because their claims about human nature influence their political philosophy and their political institutions. If you have a very negative conception of human nature, you need the Leviathan or the state to interfere, to do more of the job, right? If citizens are to a certain degree inherently bad, you need good institutions to at least get a decent society, okay? So there you hopefully see the link. These thinkers link human nature and the society very directly and explicitly, right? By leaving, for example, in the case of Hobbes, a very strong Leviathan state to prevent us from the war of everyone against all, okay? And this link of human institutions and human nature seem to be very dominant in political philosophy up to a certain degree, okay? Daniel says, Locke didn't claim human beings are evil. I would say so, yes, but he very much understood, or he would say, he has this theory of natural punishment, right? Like if you would let other beings punish themselves instead of a neutral observer, they would over-punish, for example. So therefore, he leaves the right to legislate and punish to the state because he's very worried of over-punishing of individuals, for example. So there are some aspects of him in human nature that I don't think is so enthusiastic and euphoric. But again, I would agree with you that he doesn't say they're evil. I think he's just worried about some aspects of it. Good. Now let's look at liberalism in particular. And here I would say, to understand how liberals think about human nature, it's important to look at the works of Adam Smith. And I don't want you to read Adam Smith now or whatsoever, but understanding one core idea that he puts out in many of his works, but I think most prominently in The Wealth of Nations, where he looks at markets and he says something like this, okay? The most overused quote, so I guess you're familiar with it. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, baker, and brewer that you get your bread, your beer, whatsoever, but it is their selfish intent, right? So incredible. He links here something about human nature, namely that people are selfishly acting, right? Something about intentions, and he nevertheless praises that good outcomes. Let's make it on a bigger level. There is possibility of having good social outcomes, like good society elements, coming out of citizens that don't behave in what we perceive as the good intentions, right? We haven't defined good and justice yet because, very messy. I will say more about that later on. But selfishness doesn't seem to be one amongst the list of just virtues, right? Or of goodness. And nevertheless, Smith observes that good things can come out of these selfish behaviors. And that's the invisible hand. Like whatever people tell you about the invisible hand, probably not true. What is most closest is that human action leads to better results than a human design. Okay, I'm like catching up with the chat. Yeah, there's some dispute about Locke. I should have not mentioned Locke. So, but people correct me. That's also good. Okay. Yeah, we will. It's still not clear to me how we define evil then. Okay, good. We will also touch about justice, goodness, and evil in a second. I just want to raise your awareness so far about claims about human nature, right? So as we said in the beginning, very messy. What goodness is very difficult to note, but if we detach ourselves, we could potentially think about what means goodness, right? And to a certain degree, there is an influence of human nature on all of this. Okay, so we are there now. Adam Smith is the first real thinker that I would say that says, well, I don't make an explicit claim about how human beings are overall. So he doesn't make a general claim about human nature. What he instead does is saying, well, there are good aspects to human nature, and there are not so good aspects. If you behave constantly selfish, that seems to not lead to very positive outcomes overall. But with the right institution, you can actually mediate that. Okay? So his institutional view is much more adaptive. Okay? So he says there are, or Smithians in general say, well, it really depends how the institution mitigates or like interacts with this specific dimension of human nature. There might be good aspects, and then you want the institution that makes even greater use of this good dimension of human nature. While in the case of bad or undesirable aspects of human nature, you want to mitigate that. And he says, actually, the market process is one where the intentions of the person don't really matter, right? You can have the most selfish intentions, namely to maximize your profit, and nevertheless, people benefit from it, right? And that's how you want to think about the institution. So he shifts it attention to the institutions and remains rather neutral about human nature. And that's similar to Rawls in the end, as Rawls remains to a certain degree neutral about what human nature is, right? Maybe I ask a question to the chat because you guys are also very active. What do you think is so dangerous about making claims about human nature? So you can either raise your hand or you can put it in the chat. What makes it so difficult or dangerous to make claims about human nature? Again, you can either raise your hand in the Zoom function. I have Daniel actually, so yeah, Daniel, maybe you go first.
Can I specify your question? Do you mean generally that it's dangerous to make this about human nature, or we just take it in roles and context?
No. In general, what does it make dangerous or
Okay.
problematic to talk about human nature?
Yeah. Then I will answer relying on roles. So I guess the reason roles um, delivers the role to social sciences of defining the human nature is that because when we make philosophical claims about human nature, eventually leads us to make normative claims. And normative claims lead us to disagreement, and we become detached from facts. And that's the problem, because we can think whatever we want about human nature. We can think we are kind, we are evil, we are good, we are bad, anything. But let's say empirical evidence will never change, regardless of your opinion on your human nature.
Yes, I agree with that, especially from the Rawlsian perspective. I would say what is also dangerous, not only that our institutions are also the way designed, like people wrote that in the chat, but of course we don't only have normative disagreements between these things, but there might be a second layer. Some might say, actually, human nature is changeable, right? Is malleable. So if you say that human nature is malleable, this question becomes even more dominant, right? Like if we could change human beings and make them better, and our society requires good human beings, so what do you want to do? You want to make people good, right? And that seems to be a dangerous totalitarian idea almost, because then you would have to streamline them to a certain degree, right? You don't let them live their individuality and maybe also their normative disagreements with you, but instead you streamline them amongst your idealization of what the goodness in human nature would look like, right? And that's a big debate that people have. Like, I think many have encountered the following principle, like, I would say not so sophisticated socialists often say, well, in a good society or with good citizens, socialism would work, right? And to a certain degree, Jerry Cohen makes such an argument. He says, suppose that human beings have less flaws. The problem is that we currently have flaws, but we can get rid of them. Therefore, we should design a system that could link us to that. And that's, I think, very dangerous, because if you argue about human nature, you're talking almost about like further than a re-education program, right? So let me just quickly catch up with the chat. Okay. I will, on the book recommendations, I might get back later on. But I hope it's clear that this debate about human nature is, to a certain degree, difficult to answer. Like, because how would you measure, like, what human nature is really about? Is human nature that we have in the origins of human evolution the same as now? Probably not, right? Is it nurture? Is it nature? To what degree is it nurture and nature? These seems to be completely different things. If we philosophize all of this, and base our political institutions around all of this, we get an absolute mess, right? If you are a Rousseauian or a Hobbesian and you base a lot of your political institutions on your notion of, on your philosophical notion of human nature, well, you have two approaches. First, you could be wrong and then your institutions are wrong, or you make people comply with your conception of human nature. And that seems dangerous, right? So that's why people like Rawls have said, okay, like we acknowledge these dangers of like deliberating too much philosophically about human nature. So we track certain aspects of human nature through the social sciences. For example, how human beings react to certain incentives, right? Like that's very common. Like Rawls is very sensitive towards incentives. And now recall what I said earlier about Rawls. Rawls said, well, certain inequalities are permissible as long as they benefit the least well off. Okay, that is the difference principle. And that is basically just understanding that human beings would not be fully compliant with egalitarianism. Because if everybody would get the same, we would just not put enough merit in, right? Because that seems to be a part of human nature. okay? If we are all getting out the same outcomes, that means we are all on the same level, we would not put in more work than others, right? We would become to a certain degree lazy. Because if you cannot get additional benefits over those who don't work as hard as you do, well, why would you put in the hard work? Okay, so he recognizes this feature of human nature and says, okay, we adjust our theory of justice accordingly and take incentives into consideration. Okay. I mean, the chat is like having its own life by now. I will catch up with it later. Good. So I hope that makes it some sort of clear. You know, these are all some deliberations. There's much more to say about it, and I appreciate that you ask questions, so I can touch upon it later on. I need to move on to certain things. So far, we have seen that, well, this link between good citizens and good society is very difficult. It relies often on like conceptions of human nature that are highly controversial. Okay, and then the second question is, what does it in the first place mean to have justice, right? So Friedrich August von Hayek challenged this whole idea in the first place, whether there can ever be something like justice out there, okay? So Hayek thought like, okay, like even if you have an ideal pattern in mind, like human liberty will upset such patterns. Right? It's just a mirage to ever think about something like social justice, okay? But maybe more on that later, because I have to move to one debate that seems to be linked to all of this. And this is the thing of in ideal and non-ideal theory in political philosophy. So why should we think about justice in the first place? We said, okay, we need to benchmark, for example, what is wrong about racism. We need to know what justice is, okay? And then you might say, okay, we might have a theory of justice, but it is not based on an idealized conception of society. Or we should have one based on an idealized version of society. So these are two different versions. So let's look at the first one. There are people who claim to know what justice is we have to imagine an ideal state of affairs, a kind of utopia, where we assume certain things that would allow for justice, okay? So we have to, in order to know what counts as just, and some people in the chat have asked what counts as good and what counts as bad. This is precisely the question here. In order to discover that, they say we can basically plug in everything that we think is relevant for this debate. So we can plug in any features of human nature that we need. We can plug in any circumstances that we need, and then we deliberate about the ultimate goal of justice. So if you wonder about the picture here, this is Aesop's Fables about the grapes. I don't know whether you have ever heard about it. So, you know, like the fox wants to reach for the grapes. He cannot reach it. Then he said, oh, I didn't want them in the first place because they are sour anyways, you know? So this is like kind of the fable. And what I want to express here is with, like, in order to know what is just, we have to reach over here, because otherwise we always have an easy cop out, okay? We have to know what would be the most ideal of all societies, okay? The most ideal of all societies. That's the way we should think about justice. And the best way to do so is through the use of a utopia. And the utopia is just a possibility to basically plug in anything that you need, okay? Claims about human nature, claims about availability of goods, claims about knowledge. Like, you can plug anything in a utopia to a certain degree, like actually in whatever, you know, you can say human beings will always obey all laws. Human beings will always have perfect knowledge. Human beings have an egalitarian ethos, so they love egalitarianism, they love equality between them, stuff like this, okay? This is, you can all plug in. And once you have all your features going of the ideal utopia, you can think about what your justice might look like. And that is basically magic, right? Because you can just envision the best possible society and then think about justice. And many people believe that this is the best way to think about justice. To think about the ideal society, detached from even claims about human nature. You can make out of human nature whatever you want in this case, and then deliberate about justice. Remember the example about the camping trip, right? Like some people not. Well, Jerry Cohen makes a lot of assumptions about what is going on in this camping trip, right? Like, do we treat strangers as friends? Like in our modern society, we don't treat strangers like friends, right? There is a conceptual difference. But he says, no, there's difference in a utopia doesn't really exist. You are impartial, okay? Utilitarians make the same. It's not only like the socialists, it's utilitarians make the same, that you have to be impartial. Peter Singer says, why do you save the life of your grandma instead of the life of a starving kid in the developing world, right? Impartiality. This is nothing else than ideal theory at work, right? Like you make certain claims that seem to be not really in our everyday lives happening, but you assume them away. I hope that makes clear about what ideal theorizing is. You can just basically assume anything and then theorize about justice. And there are some goods about doing so. I don't want to trash it. But you might also say, okay, instead of assuming all good things about society, we can also just think of a theory of justice that acknowledges what is called the crooked timber of humanity. Okay, and the crooked timber of humanity, that's a sentence, I think, by Kant, and then used by Isaiah Berlin very famously. And the crooked timber of humanity means human beings are inherently imperfect. They have some good aspects to them. They also have some flawed aspects to them. And the theory of justice has to accommodate for them. Because here, in the ideal case, you can just assume anything about humanity, right? You can make them perfect angels, to speak very bluntly. In ideal theory, it is possible to assume angels on Earth, right? To think about justice. And there is some good thing to it, because, you know, sometimes human nature distracts us from deliberating about what justice would mean, okay? But here, in non-ideal theory, you should assume, and you must assume, the crooked timber of humanity, okay? And so this thought experiment would never pass as non-ideal theory, because we don't treat each other in our highly complex, modern, diverse society as like a stranger as friends, right? There are some barriers. Then there's a scarcity of things. Maybe there's only one fish and not 10 fish for everybody, right? Stuff like this. And so some people wrote a critique and said, okay, you know, you are basically assuming angels to justify your political system, because you basically can justify anything if people are angels. So let me do the case of what system is better if people would be real angels. And Jason Brennan wrote a book and said, I assume that people are angels. Would they do better under socialism, or would they do better under capitalism? And he says, they would actually do better under capitalism, because angels under capitalism is even better than under socialism. So he says, ultimately, is it really telling much if you assume angels in the first place? How much is it telling you, you know, about a theory of justice? And with that, I wrap up my quick reflections on, does a good society require good people? I don't let it with any conclusions, because this is a super mess, as you can see. But I wanted to stimulate some thoughts, mainly on, wait, let me just go back to one slide, to one thing, namely to this. This was the agenda for today was this. I wanted to raise for you the conception of, if we talk about goodness of a society, we will inevitably lead to questions about justice, because the equivalent of asking what is goodness about a table for a society is kind of the question of justice, okay? So that kind of hopefully explained you how I made a move from goodness to justice. And justice is very hard to map. Some people like Hayek say, actually, you can never map it. Others like John Rawls tried it, and in my opinion, to a certain degree failed. But I mean, nevertheless, John Rawls is great. Then we talked about human nature and the role of human nature in political philosophy. Some are very optimistic, some are very pessimistic, and your view on human nature determines the political institutions, it seems, in a very harsh way. Instead, liberals remain mostly neutral about human nature and recognize this crooked timber aspect, that there are good parts and bad parts to it, and we should leave the institutions in a place that they amplify the good parts and mitigate the bad parts. And lastly, if we think about the relationship between goodness, justice, and human nature, we end up in a discussion how we should theorize about what justice means. Can we ever detach the question of justice from human nature? And I said, well, probably not, because my only intuition that I have is that ideal theory is at best. Like, I don't know. I don't have a good word. He's questionable at best. I would say non-ideal theory is the way to go. But again, I am in a political philosophy department that is mixed with economists and political scientists. So we do non-ideal theory all day long. So I'm biased. I might be. I'm not behind the wheel of ignorance. Anyways, I hope that was informative to a certain degree. I kept it with many different open questions, and I'm more than happy to now go through the chat and answer some of your questions, or just like listen to your remarks. Thank you very much for now. Good. I'm catching up with the chat. Meanwhile, you can raise your hands in the function if you want to say something, and then. Oh, and Valerie did a recommendation on humankind, on human nature. Rutger Bregman's Humankind. I recommend this book too. I'm listening to the audiobook at the moment, and I can say one thing about it. If you have ever read The Lord of the Flies, I'm writing it also in the chat. If you have ever read The Lord of the Flies, this is nothing else than kind of remarks about human nature. And so far, we have always believed that if we are stranded on a deserted island, we would fight each other like Hobbes kind of thing. But Rutger brings in great examples of actually that didn't happen at all. Human beings are much better. Like, they cooperated on the deserted islands once they have been stranded there. Anyways, I got sidetracked. I have 2 questions already. Maria and then Daniel.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, has the cognitive science influenced the discussion at all? And if so, if yes, then how?
Yeah, I would say heavily, in a sense that in the past, I would say post-Enlightenment, people thought about human nature like in a philosophical term, right? Like Hobbes and Rousseau, they just made assumptions about human nature, you know? I wouldn't say unbased, but, you know, philosophizing about human nature and approaching it through the modern tools of cognitive science, of like the social sciences, I would say gives you a much more robust understanding how, for example, human beings react to incentives, what are their inclinations, what are their flaws, you know? For example, the whole way we now think about how people digest information and how potentially there is a potential for nudge and whatsoever influences our view on institutions a lot. So I think cognitive sciences have quite a large impact on how we view human nature nowadays. And I think that's why also why social psychology plays such a big role in political departments or political science departments. Good. Then Daniel next.
Yeah, thank you. So it's actually a very hot topical lecture. So thanks for it, because it's like it's really correlates with my interest. So yeah, it was really exciting to listen to you. So my question is about let's say alternatives to ideal and ideal theory debate, because in some sense both non-ideal theorists and ideal theorists are actually stuck. They cannot get an overlapping consensus and so on, and that's why we have some alternatives. So just curious, what do you think about political realism, and if you heard about Jonathan Floyd's normative behaviorism? Thank you.
I don't know the last book, but in general, I'm in political realism. I'm to a certain degree big fan. Like, one of my favorite books of the last 2 years was, I write it in the chat, is Democracy for Realists, because I'm a philosopher captured in a social sciences department, right? So, which is great exchange, because I get double checked all the time. So I make a claim about democracy, for example. People when they come together and deliberate about the future, once everybody's argument is heard, they will reach a rational consensus. So I can say that in philosophical isolation, right? The same way that Hobbes and Rousseau deliberated about human nature. But my colleagues who work on this have empirical evidence that, well, it's not that easy. For example, if you put people on a panel together, they get actually further from each other, because if you debate, you get further from each other, not closer. Most of the features of how our debates are set up is getting us further from each other than instead of listening to each other. So whole Habermasian theory of discourse is great in theory and bad in practice to a certain degree, and they kind of keep me in check. And that's the kind of realist school I'm part of. It has to be a back and forth. Philosophers have to be double checked, and I think this is a big achievement of Rawls to a certain degree. I mean, the wheel of ignorance is a thought experiment where you can sneak in quite some social sciences, which he gets criticized for again, you know, like, because he makes it quite open and like it's not clear what kind of data points enter into this whole thing. But yeah, this is kind of my school. The second book, if you could just post it in the chat, I would be interested to read. Floyd or whatever you said, normative behavior. That would be good to know. Then, does scientific progress solve the existential problem of humanity? Yes. Okay. Good. I was just waiting for this question. Like, because at one point transhumanism has to enter into the debate, right? So like that's just the inevitable next step. Like once you think yeah, our institutions, they would just work so much better if human beings would be different, then we now have a great ideology to do that, right? Like transhumanism, like we just enhance human beings, you know? So we kind of put Elon Musk's Neuralink into their brains, and then they won't make all these irrational decisions that lead them away from becoming true liberals. You know, sometimes I hear that, like that's a literal argument that I just heard from somebody. Like, we just have to put the neural link there. People make too many irrational. If they would be rational, they would be liberals. But so we have to make them rational. We just give them like the supercomputer in their brains. They will become liberals, and we will be able to live in the open society. I think that's a weird way to think about it. First, I'm ridiculing it, but this has been for many years the Marxist kind of line of argumentation, right? Human beings, they are corrupted at this point, and so we have to kind of restructure them so that progress towards the egalitarian society is possible. So Jerry Cohen asks in a paper, how can you be an egalitarian and still be rich? Something like that. Or how can you be rich and an egalitarian? So I recommend this paper, or it's a book with a selection of papers. And there he asks, if you're committed to a certain version of justice, why are you not complying to it? Okay, so it's the big issue of compliance. And to link it back to your question, we could make human beings compliant to the demands of justice all the time, right? Like there might be some way in that we educate these angels and have like progress towards better human beings. I don't know. It could be that in the future we are just compliant with the nature of duties, but you don't want to rest your institutions on this. And this is the big learning point that I forgot to mention earlier. You don't want to rest your institutions on a potentially very good outcome of human nature, right? You don't want to rest an institution that everybody is compliant and everybody is intrinsically motivated. You design institutions so that it can alleviate worst possible outcomes, right? So even if we make progress, you know that some people will nevertheless comply and nevertheless don't feel intrinsically motivated. So that might just be a little bit linked to it. Let me just reread it. And again, okay, I'm getting on a separate rant, but like, okay, let me just bear with me for a second. Scientific progress on humanity has to make some assumptions too, because progress towards what? Progress has to have a direction. So for example, if you say human beings are currently flawed, in what regard? what is goodness, right? Bring it back to my first initial remark. So if you say that human beings are too irrational and too driven by emotion, then science can interfere and say, yes, we are now moving towards a more rational world, okay? But that's a normative assumption. And to me, it is not clear whether there's any understanding of what human goodness means. That's what I wanted to kind of raise also with this short lecture. It's very complicated to think about what makes good citizens, what makes good societies. It's a very complicated question that many different answers might be too. So instead, I'm very worried to leave it to the science community to make progress to get us better human beings, you know, like, because again, what means better? And there's much normative disagreement. And I think there are morals in. I think this deep disagreements will never be solved. So therefore, I'm very skeptical. For me, this is quite the opposite of the way you phrased the question. Okay. I have Daniel at a hand, but let me just quickly skim through the chat whether there's something. There's so much going on there. Okay. If I haven't answered your question, then please let me know. Daniel, I have a last round of questions. So Daniel, and then whoever wants to ask a question too.
Sorry for taking others' time, but yeah, too curious. If I may, I'd like to make a few remarks on your speech regarding human nature. So, first of all, you've said that good society is a just society, but even in Rosen terms, there is a certain difference between good and right, and it's rather a conception of right that defines conception of justice in Rosen theory. Second, regarding what you've said about Hobbes's point and other social contract theorists, that human nature and political institutions have a certain link, so they are related, that we accommodate political institutions to according to human nature, but that eventually means that we cannot change human nature. Like, human nature is obsolete, concrete, and unplastic, unchangeable. It cannot be somehow edited. So, doesn't it?
Well, some people think we can change human nature, right? It's malleable. If you believe the whole debate about nature versus nurture, you could change some parts of human nature, right? How human beings are. Again, people like Jerry Cohen, I think, believe to a certain degree that we are corrupted by other structures, namely the cultural hegemony of Western liberal democracy with markets and stuff like that, right? So they believe this makes us more individualized. This is a modern Marxist argument to a certain degree. Like, we become atomized. You become selfish because we detach ourselves from being ingrained in this society, right? I think that makes it so dangerous. That's why I highlighted this link. There was also something from the chat that is linked to this. Julia asks, well, Hobbes was never describing real society, meaning that it was more like a thought experiment. Yes, I agree. Although, of course, his thought experiment is somehow informed by how he sees society, right? Like, so he makes kind of to a certain degree, naturalistic fallacy there. But anyways, where do you... The thought experiment, for what Hobbes and others have been criticized for, is to even assume that you could assume such things in a just mental experiment, right? Like, the social contract is something where you enter as an individual into the contract with society, at least in a liberal version, like of John Locke, for example. You enter into the social contract by your own choice. The whole liberal thought experiments are based on the idea of consent, that you consent to be part of society. And that's something that they get questioned above. And the way they think about Human nature is something that they do in abstract, but informed by what they see, obviously, to a certain degree. At least that's what people have worked out. But it could even work out without this naturalistic fallacy. You could just like have good evidence why you would think that human beings are evil. But I think most traction of nowadays Hobbes's thought experiment is that we actually see a lot of conflict amongst people. So it's certainly in line with some empirical data points that we have. But again, it's a thought experiment, so he can just conceptualize whatever he wants. That makes it also so weird, right? To conceptualize human nature by just philosophical thinking. Good. I think I have like 2 or 3 more minutes, so if you have any more questions, people are getting there. You can either raise your hand in Zoom or really let me know in the chat if you have one more. Maria asks, isn't the whole concept of a good society dependent on the culture, values, tradition, current challenges, etc.? What do we need? One society fits them all, justice concept. Okay. If we ever do this again, maybe we can do something on justice. I think might be interesting to many people. Like so far, I didn't want to touch on which notions of justice are there. I just want to capture that it is messy, right? But people like Hayek say, well, it's actually so messy that you can never make sense out of it properly, because it's a complex issue, right? So it will be probably even be abused to reduce it to that. I think some people like Rawls attempt to have a universal conception of justice, right? That is independent of time and space. Daniel is vigorously disagreeing with me. However, I don't think that Rawls has a very clear contextualized theory of justice, which got him a lot of critiques. For example, in the Law of Peoples, he makes very clear that he is, I would say, he loves Western liberal democracy, and he would not be open to other forms of justice. So therefore, he cannot contextualize it to the local needs and maybe variances in traditions and culture. So that's got him a lot of heat, I would say. Because to a certain degree, he justifies just liberal democracy, a liberal Western democracy. So, yeah, I have the same intuition. For me, justice is a reflection of basic moral values. And for me, universal, like that also, I guess, makes me a liberal. For me, most moral truths are universal. Like it would seem to me very weird meta-ethically to claim that there are different moral truths. But again, this is like a whole different topic. I teach a module on meta-ethics at King's. So I love to discuss this topic. But again, this needs to be contextualized. I would say most liberals believe in the universality of a theory of justice, because liberalism as a tradition is a universal tradition, right? It's not anything goes. That's why we are so strong behind the value of human rights, for example. Human rights cannot be waived. We cannot say, oh, just because it doesn't fit with Russian values, we don't have human rights. No, that doesn't work like that, okay? Instead, you really have to say, okay, it's a universal concept that applies to anyone. Okay, let me catch up on the other questions. So depending on your view regarding the flexibility and changeability of human nature, we can adopt political institutions either to hold or to change it. Yes, I think that's it. I think human nature seems to be also dynamic to a certain degree. Maybe in our modern individualized societies, we might be more able to self-govern than before, because of external factors that are there, like more information available, more individual responsibility. People are used to the concept of individual responsibility. I always say, like, when I compare living in Belarus and living in Germany, I see how the impact of the Soviet Union here still plays out, like in terms of how responsibility is understood. So, like once these institutions fade out and we see the kind of some other aspects of human nature, we can adapt the institutions fitting for these purposes. And again, it's so intertwined because institutions determine certain aspects of human nature, like the need for responsibility. The Soviet Union basically erased responsibility as like a thing that we think about, like a need motivation, and therefore it needs to be certainly rebuilt. But again, much complex stuff. Can we just have a buffet, so to speak? I'm not sure what the comment relates to anymore because we have so many comments. Justice as fairness. Yes, I don't want to do a Rawls exegesis. Like, I guess Daniel is much more capable of doing so. I'm reading Rawls mainly out of my mainstream view on global justice. Like, I think I did a lot of global justice, and he gets a lot of heat for being not able to justify cultural differences. So some people even claim he's a conservative. Anyways. Artyom, Sven, I understand that's the subjective opinion, but I agree with you about the direction and some examples of good influences. Ah, yeah, that was about transhumanism. Okay, good. I think I covered most. Again, I was unable this time to keep track of the chat to a certain degree, but I think kudos to all of you. I put my contact details again on the screen in case you want to know some of the papers I mentioned, or you have other questions. Of course, like in an hour, I just wanted to give you more things to think about rather than answering questions, because this is a big topic. But I thought I'd keep it broad. So I love the exchange with you, and whenever we do this next time, we can tackle one of the other questions that I I think are interested in the group, like meta ethics. I think like what are the theory of meta ethics, stuff like this. Anyways, good. I hope that's helpful to all of you.
Okay. Sven, thank you very much. We are planning
Thank
on
you.
making another school in December, so we hope that you will be able to join us there.
Always. I hope it was as fruitful as the last times, and I enjoyed it. I mean, this time I really couldn't keep up with the chat, guys. Like, you are amazing. So that's good to see so many things being thrown around, and I learned plenty of stuff. And I think Daniel and I should have a separate session on Rawls, because I think there's much disagreement, deep, deep disagreement, to keep it in Rawlsian terms on how to interpret Rawls. And he even has a picture of Rawls behind him, and Jerry Cohen, I think, no? I can see because of the lighting. Nozick, that's Bernard Williams, Nussbaum, Jerry Cohen, and Hannah Arendt. Am I right? Good. See, I have my credentials ready. Okay, I think Daniel will fry me on Rawls, and if we could make that also happen, you know, him just frying me for an hour on my hot takes on John Rawls. I'm famous in my department for doing so. Anyways, good. Was good to chat with you. I have to run to the next appointment, but very great pleasure as usual to connect, and see you the next time.
Thank you. Спасибо большое.
Спасибо большое. До свидания.